Welcome to a very special edition of the Gospel Truth. I am now interviewing David and Tim Barton from 𝗏𝗏𝗆 Ministry, and they are just a tremendous resource on American history. And we're doing this in celebration of the 250th anniversary of this nation. And we're going back and straightening out a lot of the things that have been said, a lot of misinformation that has been given about our nation. And I tell you, this is super beneficial. So we're doing this for a 2-week period on my program, interviewing David and Tim Barton from 𝗏𝗏𝗆. So we're going to go right back into that interview and pick up where we left off. Franklin actually built an auditorium or something for Whitefield, is that correct? He built a place for him to preach?
He tried to arrange places for him to preach, but he did build a room on his own house for him to stay there when he came to there.
But in Philadelphia, they were working on an auditorium, and his thought was that Whitefield could come and preach there, so that's not incorrect. But all of this to say is there's so many wide accusations, it kind of depends on where the accusation goes. With that being said, Franklin is one of the fun guys that, from our standpoint, to talk about, because he is so misrepresented that, for example, there were 56 guys who signed the Declaration. So as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation, we're really celebrating what 56 men came together and through absolute divine providence guiding them, as Jefferson writes a declaration, as they work together, and then obviously God's help in the Revolution. There's so many God moments in this. But what those 56 men did is quite unique. If you look at those 56 men, this idea, well, they really weren't religious. They were secular, atheists, agnostics, deists. They wanted a separation of church and state. Franklin is one of the guys people usually point to. Franklin and Jefferson are the top guys, but Franklin is my favorite to talk about because Franklin, people think, well, he was secular his whole life. And I will bring up the fact that of the 56 signers of the Declaration, there's only one who ever self-identified as a deist. And that was Franklin.
And by the way, what you said on sexual promiscuity, I said that because there's a big narrative out, especially in colleges, that he was involved in all sorts of affairs when he was over in France. And that's not, but he did have one illegitimate children. So the huge promiscuity is what I was reacting to.
Yes, when he represented America over in Europe, there's a letter from John Adams where he says he's being inappropriate with these young ladies because Franklin's in his 70s flirting with these French girls. And historians universally agree, Franklin did not do anything other than have a flirtatious encounter with a couple of them. But people that are like, well, we know what that means. And it's like, no, that's literally, there's no historic evidence for that.
Judging those days by our days.
That's exactly right.
Have been today.
Exactly right.
Let me also ask you this, that Franklin, that you had a movie come out recently about this. And I know that you guys haven't seen the whole thing, but what's your opinion of that? Because it portrays Franklin and Whitefield as being joined together.
So that's literally where I want to go with this. Because when people think that Franklin was a deist, and I acknowledge, he actually said it, I would ask. And I wish,
explain the deist thing.
So I wish I would have brought the book with me, because where Franklin says he's a deist was in his autobiography. And I always ask people, have you read it? And most people are like, no, I never have. And I say, okay, you can look it up online. It's not a hard thing to find. And read the page and a half surrounding where he says I was a deist. Because what he says is, when I was 15 years old, I read the debates between these 3 pastors and this deist. And as I was reading the debates, it struck me, this deist is making better arguments than these pastors are. So I determined I would be a deist. And my friends, they became deists. But then I saw how my friends began to treat other people. And I saw how they treated me, and I didn't like it at all. And I realized, although the deist might have been correct in some of his position, that this belief itself was really of no value and no use. So I left that behind.
He's a deist for about a week and a half.
Yeah, so by Franklin's own admission, it's when he was a young teenager, and maybe for a week and a half was he a deist.
That's really interesting.
But again, this is when he's younger. As you go on, it's also super interesting that Franklin is one of these guys that if you start to read his letters, you actually find that there's a great letter, 1753, that Franklin wrote to Joseph Huey. And Franklin was actually giving a little criticism about this local minister who, from available evidence of the letter, it seems like the local minister said, if you're not part of my church, you don't really love Jesus. And Franklin's like, that's not what the Bible says at all. And Franklin goes through several paragraphs where he just says, this is what Jesus said, and this is what Jesus said, and this is what the Bible says.
All Bible verses.
And it's back to back to back, and there's no reference. And if you read the letter, you'd go, well, this seems religious, but I want to point out that there's no concordance, there's no Google, right? Franklin, to be able to write this, he only can write it because he knows it, right? Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. What's in him is coming out of him. Well, how in the world did that get in him? Well, it's because several years earlier, he had started this friendship with the guy he thought was one of the best orators he's ever heard, one of the most influential speakers, one of the most dynamic voices, where Franklin, as a scientist, also does the study where he wants to see, like, how big of a crowd could this guy speak to? And so he starts at the front of a place where Whitefield is speaking and begins stepping away. And I think it was like nearly a mile.
Yeah, he said he'd always read in the great Roman wars how the generals would speak to 100,000 soldiers in the valley. And I said, I never believed it. And so he said he started backing up and backing up and backing up. And when he got to where he could not hear Whitefield any longer, he said, okay, how far is that? What's the radius? How many people fit in it? He said Whitefield could easily do 100,000 people. That's hearing amazing. Him without
the power of his voice.
And also explain this, I don't know the details, you fill it in, but during the Constitutional Convention, they hit an impasse. And so what did Franklin do?
So Franklin is the guy that at the Constitutional Convention, it was on June 28, 1787, when they've been there for 4.5 weeks. They at this point, they've gone through the revolution. They have the Articles of Confederation, which is really not a good governing system. And everybody knows we got to do something different. This is not going to work if we're going to remain a nation together. And so when the states send their delegations, most states had given their delegation instructions or ideas of what we think government should look like. And not surprisingly, the delegations did not agree in their ideas. And so for the first 4.5 weeks, they're just arguing and bickering. And it was actually reported that George Mason, who was one of the delegates at Virginia, he gets up to leave. George Washington, it was reported, he goes and walks alongside his carriage and compelling him, trying to convince him, like, please, George, don't leave. We've paid too high a price to get to this point. Don't abandon it now. And George Mason tells George Washington, because of you, I will come, because I respect you. I'll come back for your sake, but I think we're wasting our time. So it's in that moment that then Franklin gets up and gives the longest speech he gives during the entire Constitutional Convention, June 28, 1787. And
it's the only one he gave out of his heart. All the others he wrote out beforehand and had somebody else speak them. This one he wrote out afterwards because Madison came to him and said, hey, would you write down what you said? So this was out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks.
So, and this is also great because in Madison's notes, there is the writings where Madison writes, Franklin says, hey, I'm trying to keep notes of everything we did, and I couldn't write fast enough for what you were saying. Can you send me what you wrote down? And Franklin says, I was just speaking from the heart. I didn't write it down. He says, but I'll think back and try to write down everything that I remember I was trying to say. And so that's what we have is the best available representation. But Franklin says, in this situation, this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, scarce able to distinguish it and present it to us, how has it happened, sirs, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? Well, he goes on for it's a page and a half of what he ends up sending Madison of this call where he's challenging everybody else. We need a time of prayer. Well, it's his call that actually leads Washington, who's the chair of the convention. He, in his own records, he identifies not only they took a recess, they called it a cooling off period, but Washington says as a delegation, they went to the local church of the Reverend
William Rogers.
William Rogers, thank you, the Reverend Rogers. And for 3 days, he led them in these patriotic and spiritual orations. And when they came back, some of the founding fathers noted that the entire atmosphere was now different. It had changed. And this is, again, significant for lots of reasons, because this is the one today people say, well, that's the least religious founding father. And I don't disagree. I think Franklin is one of the least, if not the least religious founding father.
But he's more religious than most of our leaders.
He'll be just about any Christian we put up against him today.
And I'll even back up to go further, because Franklin's also the guy, when we separate from Great Britain, he's on a committee of 3 that's challenged with coming up with a national motto. So Franklin, John Adams, and Jefferson are all in this committee to come up with a national motto. And his suggestion for the national motto is brilliant. I've been talking. Why don't you tell him what it is?
Yeah, the national motto he came up with, they designed it. It was Moses in the chariot. So coming out of Egypt.
Moses on the other side of the Red Sea, Pharaoh in the chariot.
That's right. Moses on this side of the Red Sea, Pharaoh in the chariot coming, and the seas coming in on the enemy. And the motto was rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And so that was his motto, and the image was biblical. And
could you give me a little more of that speech that he said, though? Because he was talking about if a sparrow can't fall without God's notice, how can a nation
Is
rise?
it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel, and we shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessing on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Now, there's more to the prayer.
How many people do you think can quote what Benjamin Franklin
Well, two of them are sitting right here.
You may be the only two that can quote that, but that is profound to me for a guy who's supposed to be the least religious, and yet he's saying something so profound.
And in that short thing that we quote, there's 14 biblical references. Wow. So Father of Lights, James 1:17, Tower of Babel, Genesis 8. I mean, there's 14 biblical references in there. And this is the guy that's your least religious.
Right.
And he's doing this off the cuff, extemporaneous.
And his challenge, when they end up taking 3 days off, part of what their strategy was, and it's silly, but it's human nature, they said, look, we are fully supportive of bringing a pastor in, but there's already some tension because people know we've been arguing, and if a pastor comes in now, there might be reason for people to doubt or distrust a governing document we do. And somebody's like, wait a second. The 4th of July is coming up. What if we bring in a pastor to do a spiritual oration, and then we're like, hey, why don't you just stay with us? And then nobody will suspect anything. And so they do this silly plan, and I say silly because they were afraid how it might look if they brought in a pastor early. But what happened is, when they bring in those pastors remained, during the American Revolution, they had chaplains in Congress. Starting from the Reverend 𝗍𝗶𝗆, they had pastors present. Well, there wasn't a pastor present at the Constitutional Convention until Franklin's motion to call to prayer. Then they bring a pastor in. Well, that chaplain who remains on, that becomes then the foundation that when we finally get the Constitution and we finally get a Congress, we have a chaplain of the House and the Senate. And actually, we can go back and credit Franklin's call to prayer for being part of the impetus to reintroduce a chaplain, that we have a chaplain in the House. Franklin's one of the guys responsible for us having a chaplain of the House and the Senate, that every single session of Congress, when they're starting something, the chaplains open it in prayer. Franklin's the guy behind that. And so when people again today, they're like, well, he wasn't religious. No, there's a difference between least religious and anti-religious. He was never anti-religious.
Andrew will be right back after these messages.
We give away a lot of free product. We now have over 100 million books, DVDs, CDs that I have distributed free of charge. You can go to our website, and I have over 200,000 hours of free teaching there. If you listen 8 hours a day, it would take you 66 years to get through. We've got a lot of free material, so check it out at awmi.net. We want to be a blessing and share God's Word with you.
And now, here's Andrew.
And these are some of the works from some of the other founding fathers. This got to be one of my favorites. So this is the Psalms of David. This is done by signer of the Declaration, Francis Hopkinson. Francis Hopkinson is the guy who designed the Great Seal of the United States. He was an original justice put on the court by George Washington, original judge. Great guy, but he's a church music director and choir leader. And so we have a number of Isaac Watts hymn books and psalters, and what they are is it's a psalms set to music, but you don't see the music. You have a cantor that sings the music. You look at the words, you just follow the melody, repeat the melody you just heard. And this is the first time ever that you have in America the psalms set to music. So there's musical notation here. And the musical notation you've got here, what he did, and this is a signer of the Declaration who is a judge and an attorney and a music director, he put the entire book of Psalms to music. So when you're taking 150 Psalms, now, of course, hopefully you think of Psalms 119. Oh, what would that be? You know, that's the longest Psalm in the Bible. In this book, Psalms 119 is 38 pages long.
Wow.
Imagine opening a hymn book on Sunday morning and saying, and then the music director says, hey, let's sing that again. That was really good. It's like, no, but see, this is the kind of stuff we don't hear about founding fathers. This is a Bible from John.
Well, let me ask you this. People say that the founding fathers were secular. We've been talking specifically about Benjamin Franklin, but how do you respond to that? And we're relating it to the Great Awakening and stuff. I've heard without the Great Awakening and without the move of God in this nation, we wouldn't have had it.
Unquestionably.
I'm going to go to something he does. He and I both speak at a lot of universities. He speaks it more than I do. And one of the things I've always loved doing, I remember being at Duke University Law School, I put up a picture of the signers of the Declaration. And those guys up there that signed it, and I said, who can you name? And everybody found Jefferson and Franklin. And they're the two least religious, even though they're not least religious.
Well, no, they're least. They're not anti-religious.
Yeah, they're by degrees, they're more religious than most Christians today. So he carries the gift card. And it says, anybody that can name 5 on that picture, I'll give you this gift card. He's had it for 9 years.
Wow.
So nobody knows those guys. And so what happens when somebody says, oh, they're all such and such? Oh, really, who? Which ones are you talking about? And you start asking specifics and they have no clue.
This is what I would suggest, because again, this is something that's a very common tactic, because whether someone says, well, we know all of them had slaves. We know none of them were religious. All of them wanted separation from church and state.
Talk about your professor. Right.
And instead of me saying why you're wrong, anytime someone makes a claim, the burden of proof is on them to defend their position. Mm-hmm. And so I don't need to go through all the reasons you're wrong. I'm going to say, right, okay, so John's baptism, was that of man or God, right? Because what Jesus did is he asked questions. There were very few times that he answered. Now, if it was an honest question, he might have answered it. But usually, he's dealing with people that are making these crazy inflammatory statements. And so I had a professor one time, after I talked about the founding fathers giving us this biblical foundation and challenging us that if we ever remove religion and morality, America will cease to function. And he got up and said, how can you suggest that the founding fathers believed in religion and morality, that they were moral people at all when we know all of them had slaves? And I said, well, just to clarify, are you suggesting all of them had slaves? He said, we know all of them had slaves. And I said, okay, let's just take the 56 signers of the Declaration, because that's an easy quantity to measure and go through. John Adams. Tell me about John Adams. Did John Adams have slaves? All of them did. I said, actually, I'm pretty sure John Adams never had slaves and fought against slavery his whole life. He said, oh, I don't know about John Adams, but all the others did. I said,
John Adams is the guy that defended, is it Amistad?
John Quincy Adams, his son.
That's his son.
But guess where John Quincy Adams learned it from?
Yeah.
Right? His dad was teaching him this. I went through Sam Adams, I went through Roger Sherman, and I went through 5 or 6 people before finally he was like, okay, I don't actually know who did or didn't have slaves. I know the majority did, but this is the problem, is most of what happens is accusatory tone of, or they weren't religious, but again, you have the burden of proof, so I'm going to say, well, which ones? And if you're going to say Franklin and Jefferson, I'm going to say, okay, just a contrast. You give me the ones you know weren't religious, and I'll give you the game we used to play. I'll give you 5 that were religious for every one you give me that weren't, and let's see who runs out first.
Amen. Let me also point this out, that slavery and things like this it would be comparable today to abortion. And people today say, well, you believe in abortion. Why? Because that has been done during this day. And so they think that everybody here believes in abortion. Yeah. And yet, man, there's a huge amount of, I don't believe in abortion. No. And yet they would say, but you lived during a day where that was.
I totally agree. I think there's going to be a time when we look back at abortion with the same hatred we have with slavery now. And people living here, we talked earlier, there's about 70% of the nation that thinks abortions are okay. But there's going to be another generation that comes along, Lord willing, that gets their act together biblically, and we'll see this as being a bad time.
And I think I also heard you guys say that, I think it was Mason and, anyway, you'd have to correct me. It's Mason and maybe Washington that petitioned to try and get rid of slavery, and they wouldn't allow it in Virginia. It was against the law.
There's a whole list of them. We probably need to do that in the next episode.
Okay.
Because there's going to be a lot to dive into. But I do want to back up to this abortion thing, because I think this is one of the good evidences of the third Great Awakening we're in. Because if you go back, First Great Awakening is what America is built on. But the First Great Awakening it's actually not a period of unity in America. The Second Great Awakening, by the way, the same. They were not unifying times in America. They were clarifying times where truth and morality were debated. The American Revolution, it's 25% of Americans that supported the cause of liberty, probably 25% opposed, and probably 50% are somewhere in the middle, and just want to see what happens. It wasn't a unifying time, but God position people to offer clarity in the midst of incredible friction. And the Second Great Awakening is easier for people to see this because in the midst of the Second Great Awakening, Charles Finney, the most noted leader, and we can talk about this more in another program, in the 1820s and 30s is the highlight of his ministry, 1825 to 1835. And during the height of his ministry, nearly every major denomination in America split over the issue of slavery. In the midst of the Second Great Awakening, and most Americans look and think historically, well, awakenings, that's like when we hold hands and we just worship together. Actually, no, it's a very divided time, and it's actually the end of the awakenings. There was incredible conflict, and at the end of the conflict, truth and morality prevailed. And ultimately, if it wasn't for the Second Great Awakening, slavery is not ended in America. But if it's not for the Third Great Awakening, we probably don't end abortion in America. And I think that's exactly part of what we're seeing, because even the gender debates we're having right now, or what's a man and what's a woman, can biological males playing girls sports, going girls, like it's crazy we're having these debates. It's crazy. But that's what happens in these awakening times. It's friction over things that aren't always confusing in the Bible, and yet God is on the move. Conflict does not mean God is not moving or an awakening is not happening. Debates over truth and morality and the clear evidence of the move of God is an indication there's an awakening happening right now.
You know, the Lord spoke to me March the 5th, 2021 about being in the Third Great Awakening. So I contacted you guys and you came on my program and you brought these things out, that the First Great Awakening caused a revolution. The Second Great Awakening caused a civil war. And this Third Great Awakening, we see this nation just splitting. And I really believe it is an evidence of a great awakening that we are in. It's awesome what God's doing.
It is. It's not what we would have thought we'd planned.
But people think that, like you were saying, it's just all holding hands and everybody in union, but it's not. It splits the godly.
Prevails.
Light and darkness. The middle ground leaves. And so that's where we are. Anyway, we're just about out of time again. We're going to continue to talk about this, but let me mention that we've got some materials. So this is a CD, and then I also have DVDs that were taken from these television programs where David and Tim are talking about all of these things. And then this is a USB that will have the audio and the video on it. Again, your guys' website is what? Wallbuilders.com?
Wallbuilders.com, yes, sir.
And you've got a lot of material. Do you know how? You got videos, you got all kinds of instruction, educational things.
There will be thousands of resource articles too. Just about anything that they'll come up with in school probably is covered there. So we've got a lot of visual materials, a lot of written materials, but a lot of resource materials for people wanting to do research.
That's awesome. So I encourage you to check that out and also get these materials and join us again, because we're going to continue to talk about this for the rest of this week and also next week. And we're going to get into a lot of things that I believe will help you understand that this nation is special. It is not the thing that has been represented by those who hate this nation and are trying to discredit it. And I believe this is good for you. It'll also be good for you to get this and share it with somebody else and share this truth with other people. So thank you for joining us. Join us again tomorrow, and then also next week as we continue our interview with David and Tim Barton.